Good morning, everyone. I'm Scott Mitchell, a professor here at Carleton University. I'm going to start us off today and wrap things up at the end. The stuff I'm going to be talking about to get things going, though, really is, well, both times is a result of input from a lot of people, and I want to introduce here my co-authors first. Listed in alphabetical order. So John Bolte is online. I don't know if you have a mic on, John. Well, good morning to John. Hopefully he's hearing this. He's our partner at Oregon State University, who is the lead developer for the Envision modeling framework that we'll be talking about. Sampsa Hämäläinen is here in the room from Agriculture Canada here in Ottawa. Patricia Larkin's not here with us today, but she was started off working on this project with us as a side project while she was doing her PhD at University of Ottawa, and she's got a postdoctoral position now. Dan McDonald's here in the room as well. He'll be talking to you within the hour, also from Agriculture Canada here in Ottawa. Tanya Tanner is in the room here as well. She's a grad student here at Carleton University. Amadou Thiam from Omafra which one is he based out of now? Kemptville. Is not here today, but has been a partner throughout this work. Ruth Waldick is actually the co-primary applicant for this work with me. She usually based out of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. She's on leave from there right now, but is actually an adjunct professor here at Carleton. And finally, Anna Zitseva will also be talking today and is here in the room, and she's a research associate here at Carleton University. Looking at my notes for reminders. There's one more logo up there, IISD. Did I accidentally skip? Oh, right. Livia Bizakova from the International Institute of Sustainable Development has been a partner all through this work as well. But her presentation, for lack of time, was in the first webinar and is not as relevant to this one. But I'll have a brief mention of some of her work in some of my slides. Before we get going, I just want to remind everybody that this system is quite sensitive and tries to pick up every bit of noise that it can. So if you're here in this room, remember there's microphones all over the room, and so you make a little bit of noise and everybody in the webinar hears it too. And if you're participating remotely, we'd love to hear from you if you want to give feedback or ask questions. We do ask because sometimes it does cause feedback. Just a reminder that if you keep your microphones on mute when people are not trying to get our attention, that would be great. Thank you. Having said that, we will be asking occasionally if people have questions at a particular time, please ask them. But if you would like to ask something at a particular slide, we've tried to build enough room for uncertainty throughout the agenda so that that's possible as well. So feel free to get our attention at any time. Okay, so what is this project all about? This work started out when Ruth Waldick led a project called Farms to Regions out of Agriculture Canada. And I think I actually joined it up in its second year or something like that. This project that we're talking about today continues that collaboration, extending the original tools and shifting the focus in ways that I'm going to try and summarize quickly here now. Our objective is to create and deliver information about current and future climate extremes that will affect Ontario's agricultural sector and rural communities. But when we say extremes, we don't I'd like you to keep in mind that we're not talking about extremes the way most people typically think of as extreme weather, in that it's not just the most dramatic floods, droughts, tornadoes, ice storms, that kind of thing that we're talking about. We decided to focus much of our effort on changes that matter to agriculture in this region, looking for changes to weather patterns and specific events or combination of events that will have significant impacts on agriculture. So what are the implications of the changes to these patterns? To do this, we had to learn about the processes that farmers use to adapt to weather and figure out how the stresses from weather have been changing and are likely to change in the future. Today, we will focus on the decision support tools that help put this all together. That refers to software and data that compare the weather we've experienced, experiences of people that have been working on the land in this region, and different groups of different groups' projections of what might happen in the future to figure out what situations are likely and what bits about those conditions matter to agriculture and our communities and how we can be prepared for them. We're using a scenario-based approach, and what we mean by that is that we're thinking about what some alternative likely possible futures are and follow through with what, based on our experience and the best research so far, we might expect the consequences to be. Based on those, we can think about how we might be impacted and therefore respond. A lot of the effort in that first Farms to Regions project that I mentioned went into scenario development. For this project, our team here at Carleton has been working jointly with Agriculture Canada and IISD, also engaging with people from OMAFRA, regional conservation authorities, public health experts, local agronomists and farmers, and so on, to extend the previous developed tool by pulling in locally relevant information that is specifically focused on the impacts of extreme weather shifts. We've documented that weather pressures on agriculture are shifting, and later you'll hear about the seasonal phenology indices that are referred to on this slide. And we also calculate several more general resilience indices that have broader relevance. Okay, so as I mentioned briefly, the Farms to Region project involved extensive consultation to identify what scenarios are relevant for assessing adaptation options and figuring out how to structure those scenarios into processes and flows in our decision support tool. The first version of that tool was released along with documentation such as the mainstreaming climate change report shown here on slide 3. Sorry for anybody that's following on your own slides. And this documentation is all available on our website, and even more. That's report came out in 2015, if I remember correctly, and even more recently in 2017, a published paper by Ruth and Livia and some other co-authors has come out as well. So during that process, that Farms to Regions project, it created a base that we were able to build on to explore the new focus that's on extreme weather. The diagram here in slide 4 is a systems diagram that was developed in that first project, and it's an attempt to capture what are all the relevant drivers and related factors, concentrating on, but not being completely exclusive to, agricultural systems in Eastern Ontario. So in this project that we're talking about here today, we worked a lot on the climate driver section of this figure, and that has impacts on the whole systems. And then in terms of impacts, we concentrated on fleshing out the capabilities of in the decision support tool on the food and feed and land use and cover boxes in this diagram. So that's most of what you'll hear about today. Slide 5. So why this shift to looking at the impacts of extreme weather? From the start of this work, we grew concerned that a lot of the existing work on the likely impacts of climate change on agriculture tends to focus on changes to integrative measures, things like averages or sums. And that can present a real rosy picture. So for example, in these graphs here, looking at the trend in growing season length in this area or in crop heat units, you see that you're getting longer seasons, you're getting more energy available to grow the crops. But changes to averages and sums aren't all that is happening, and it's not likely to continue to be the only important thing out there. So we wanted to focus on what are the impacts of changing extremes. What is happening? What is changing to the distribution of weather within seasons? And what is the importance of that to agricultural production? And that's a lot more complicated, and yes, it does mean that there's a lot more uncertainty involved. So slide 6 now, we tried to think about what that means, about what does the extra uncertainty that brings in mean to how we can assess likely impacts? And we ended up on this focus on scenario-based modeling with phenological indices being a big part of what we do as a result of that. All those climate change models, the GCMs, they are running scenarios, not specific predictions of what is going to happen. And it's hard to justify layering a single prediction of the ecosystem response, for example, crop yield, on top of that, particularly when there's a lot of different assumptions about what the reactions and possible adaptations from all the ecosystem components, including the humans. We know that global climate models have a lack of spatial and temporal detail in their output, at least compared to the kinds of models that might be used to look at things like crop growth. And also for all sorts of other questions that are relevant to doing regional evaluations of risk and potential trade-offs when adapting to climate change. There can be very high uncertainties if you're moving to finer resolutions in space and time. Typically, this requires a lot of assumptions and possibly very high data needs. We can't confidently fill all those needs with data, but we can explore a likely range of possibilities with confidence and consider different sets of likely parameters under scenarios that explore our future options. So that's why the emphasis on scenarios. And by similar logic, a lot of approaches to crop modeling focus on crop yield, for example, using either a process-based approach, which has high uncertainty in the parameterization across large regions, or empirical models, which are usually assuming that the same conditions apply everywhere in time and space. So that presented some pretty daunting problems. So instead, by concentrating on the impacts of specific weather patterns with respect to the development stages of crops, we can focus on relative impacts on farming operations under different scenario and landscape contexts without getting bogged down in the uncertainties of detailed process modeling. So that's why we're talking about a concentration on the phenological impacts of weather patterns. So that means it's the intersection of the weather occurring at different times of the season with agricultural operations and crops that are at different growth stages. And in this project, we are focusing on Eastern Ontario, but part of the objective was then to report back about our experiences in ways that would help set up similar kinds of operations where warranted in other regions. By talking about Eastern Ontario, here is one version of what Eastern Ontario is, and this shows the whole region that data was gathered for in terms of weather data and climate model predictions, and in the presentation that Anna will be giving in a while, you get a summary of the work that she did to characterize what has been happening in terms of shifts in weather patterns. In the actual decision support tool, you may notice if you're paying attention that all our maps are on a sub-region of this. Essentially, it's 3 municipalities, 2 counties, and the amalgamated city of Ottawa for feasibility reasons, and also because that captures the most dominant, the part of Eastern Ontario that is dominated by agriculture. So that was mostly on background and the objectives of this project. What have we actually been working on for the last 3 years? That's what we're going to try and summarize in this pair of webinars, the one that was given back in June, talking more about the concepts and reporting on the results, and this one's getting much more into the technical nitty-gritty of the development of the decision support model itself. For all that work, the first activity, which took up most of our time in the first year for sure and continued after that, was background work of seeing what the data sets were that were available, what we would need to do to make them more relevant to us, what could we trust, what could we not trust, put qualifications on what we could do with different kinds of data. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a follow-up slide here, but then the rest of today we'll go through these other overall. Dan McDonald will speak next on the improvements we made to the farm model within our decision support tool. Samsa will be talking about some details on how the data had to be processed to create the data set that drives all this. Then after lunch, Tanya will talk about farm types, farm size, and trends of these things through time, and how those dynamics got put into the model. Anna will talk about the crop-specific indicators that I introduced just a minute ago. We also have a bunch of work on general resilience indicators. That work was carried on by Ruth and Patricia and Livia. We've got one slide at one point today about that, but if you would like to know more about that work, there is a presentation in the June webinar, which is available up on the website. And the other big piece of this, of course, is dissemination. So these two webinars are a big part of that, and all the material that is, some of it is up on the website already, and through this last month of reporting, we'll be getting all the rest of that up online as well. Okay, as many people listening in today know, there can be challenges making sense of both the known information about what weather has been in the past and predictions of what might happen under different scenarios in the future, if what you're trying to do is figure out what measurements or predictions made for one spatial location or a region or some other phenomenon, what that means for people and or processes at very specific locations on the planet that may not perfectly line up with the measurements or the predictions. And we're concentrating on extreme weather, and if you're studying what has happened at specific locations in space or during a specific window in time, for individual predictions of future processes, you're often setting up such a specific context that you have a good risk of missing out on all the possibilities that could happen in the future. One way modelers typically deal with the particular challenges of looking at extremes is to look at the range of predictions from a wide range of climate models and assume that the range of predictions tells you something about the variability of the process that you might expect. But actually that range of predictions is driven by uncertainty in the models, not really about the normal variability in time and space of things like weather. So you're not getting really the variability that affects farm scale or local community planning, and so you have to be aware of that and try to work around it. At the same time, if you're a local community or an agricultural organization that's trying to make sense of all these different data sets that are out there, or future climate change predictions that are available to you from the scientific community, and then there's lots of problems if you're trying to make sense of all those options and such mundane things as trying to figure out how to deal with weather stations that have data for one block of time and then they go out for a while and then they come back on, or how do you make sense of climate change predictions that are made for large spatial units and you would like to know details about what happens underneath those units. So knowing that there is this confusion, one of the main objectives of this project has always been to bring together experts from the various fields and document our experiences, our own experiences navigating this mess, choosing the compromises that we decided that we can live with, and sharing our findings along with the data that we've been able to clean up and document. And so sharing the data sets and dissemination about all this information is a big part of what we're trying to do as well. So getting more into the details of the tool that we're talking about today. So this is slide 10 now for those people flipping their own slides. This is showing a screenshot of one view of our scenario modeling framework. It's built with a more general spatial scenario exploration environment called Envision. And so that's the system that John Bolte, who's on the line hopefully now, has developed and has been used for a lot of different applications, and you can see some of the other applications and study areas at the Envision website. Briefly, it combines an agent-based decision modeling environment with spatial databases and a growing library of plugins that simulate or calculate different aspects of what's happening across the landscape. So it is a framework and can do a lot of different things. When we talk about our Envision model, we're talking about taking that Envision framework and using it to look at these processes that impact agricultural and communities across eastern Ontario. And we'll be showing you more of the details of that today. So the Farms to Regions project did start with this framework, and it created a tool using mostly some of the existing plugins that were available and some existing models that could be put into the required coding framework to be used in Envision within the time slot that was available for that project. And then our project in the last 3 years, we've been concentrating on developing new custom modules to better simulate climate impacts and agricultural processes in the area. Okay. Next slide, slide 11. So zoomed in a little more in that interface, we can see some of the individual polygons which form the the integrated decision units, or IDUs, which are the base spatial unit for all work in the Envision environment. So in a little while, Dan and Samsa will go into more detail about how these were delineated and then attributed with data. But for now, you should understand that in Envision, all decisions, all processes act on the IDUs. So from our point of view, that means that all the decisions about what is going to be planted and what is the impact of weather on agricultural operations operates at this unit. So we had to think about what is the appropriate level of detail and space that would be needed to scale up all those processes to the broader region. So we can't get more detailed than this, and we figured if you're talking about the impact of weather on farm operations, you pretty much need to get down to the field level. And so in our Envision database, wherever there are fields, those are the individual smallest units that we are talking about. So this had to be extracted from existing information using a combination of cadastral, transportation, hydrological, and land cover data, and we'll hear more about that soon. That ended up in our study region through a series of refinements that continue to go on to roughly 110,000 polygons representing this version of Eastern Ontario. Okay, I wanted to be able to demonstrate a little bit what our Envision model looks like, how it works. This is a little bit challenging in that now that there is so much detail in there and so many processes are being considered across a large data set, if I wanted to actually show you model runs, it would take way too long. We'd all be standing here waiting for the computer. So this is not a kind of model that you run and watch it like a video game. It takes too much time for that. It's a tool that lets you bring together a whole bunch of data, set up a bunch of constraints, run it through all the processes, and gather the output. So I thought I'd try and find a combination of figures that I could show you today that help
targeted
overall. So to start with, there is a video embedded in this slide. This is slide 12. Hopefully it works for remote people as well. Hopefully it works for me. That didn't start it. I have to click on this screen. Oh, it is started. Whoops, too far. Back. Let's start that again. So this is showing Envision. The framework has just been fired up, and now I'm choosing one of the parameter files that specifies which set of data I want to load into it, and this is going to load in all the combination of data sets and modules that have been programmed to simulate the environment here in Eastern Ontario. It actually takes a long time to load in those 110,000 polygons and all the data with it, so I've cut out huge pieces of these videos to speed things up. So there it's now showing the 3 counties that I mentioned, Eastern Ontario, and I'm going through to set up an actual model run. So the scrolling menu at the top right now is showing you a bunch of all the scenarios that are available, and the scenarios are a combination of the scenarios that came out of the Farms to Regions project. So I think I've chosen here came out of
be the principal
overall. Also choosing one GCM scenario, so one particular climate model from the AR5 suite of possibilities, or actually a subset of it that specializes on being acceptable at modeling extremes, and using the RCP 8.5 pathway. Then it goes ahead and starts going day by day through every year. I told it to only do 5 years here to get this done in time. But normally you would want to do it over maybe a couple decades or something like that. So it's running through it day by day and saying, okay, what weather is hitting us today? What are the impacts of that on agricultural operations? Calculating the general resilience factors and so on. And tallying all that up across all the years of the scenario run. Then in the interface, you can go through and see some of the results from it. So right now, I've chosen to, unfortunately, when it goes through the video conferencing system, it results in a very small font size, so it's hard to see what it is. But it's showing graphs of things like growing season length, and I forget what the first one that came up was. Indices that describe the what went on in the weather as it intersects with agriculture in the region that year. You can also call up tables of outputs, and again, that font size is so small we can't actually see it, but if you look at the slides online afterwards, you can actually check that out. And the other thing it can do is map some of the results, and so this one is going through changes in some crop cover just through the 5 years, so it's not incredibly dynamic. However, and that should be the end of the video, yes, we haven't focused much in this round of changes to the model in this 3-year project we're talking about today on those outputs, because each one of those runs is actually just one of the scenarios, and like I mentioned before, we want to look at a range of scenarios. So usually what we would do is do this many times to gather outputs from the different scenarios and then use output files to go through and extract the information that we need. This I'll show you in another way in a minute, is how we get at the configuring Envision. Actually, I can show you right now. Sorry, those of you looking at your own slides, I'm just switching to another screen that allows me to scroll around in that document that is showing up in the slide. So this is, I wanted to show you that this is how we configure Envision. We have a big data file with a lot of the parameters in it. The idea here is there are parameters that you might want to be able to change in the future to develop more alternative scenarios, or to put in more crop possibilities, for example, or different crop rotations and so on. It's just a matter of changing the configuration file. So whenever possible, that was done in a configuration file instead of hardwiring it into the programming of the model. A little bit more about that this afternoon. Back to the slide. There we go. So I mentioned that to get at outputs, we tend to do all the runs and not make much use of the interactive possibilities in Envision for looking at the outputs, although those could be very attractive for other questions or for different levels of spatial detail. We rely a lot on the attribute tables for some things, so while it's doing all that processing through all the IDUs, it's also using the attribute table for that spatial database to pull in a lot of input data, but then it also spits out, optionally, spits out outputs at different yearly intervals, and you can see how things change on the spatial units, how crops change, how, as Tanya will talk about this afternoon, how farm size can change and so on, farm types can change. And also, it's every time you run through one of these scenarios, it spits out a huge number of data files. You can't see them all on the screen there, but in this particular run, I counted there were 71 files that it spits out with all sorts of other information about what's going on. So, for example, one of the files that shows up there is called a crop event pivot table, and we use that to record all the different events that went on in every field. Things like, okay, it got too dry, so, or let's talk about this year's situation. It was way too wet, so planting got delayed by 10 days or something like that. All those kinds of events are all captured in there, and then we can extract that out and build summaries of it, and you'll see some examples of that in presentations from my colleagues. And we've written a bunch of scripts that help automate that process, and those scripts are also being made available on our website. Speaking of the website, like I said, that's a big part of our dissemination plan. So all the data sets, the links to the Envision model itself, the processing tools that are used to create the data sets, and documentation for all this are made available through our web portal. So our today's webinar, the slides are already up. The video of this is all being recorded, and for both webinars is being chopped into manageable sizes and being made available to you there. And so you can go back to that at any time in the future. So the URL for the website is given here. And the other thing Yeah. So the Envision model itself, here's the interface. If you download it now from
Just one.
our,
We get
you do get, along with everything else, the custom plugins or the modules that we've been developing with John for this program. They get called on if you also download our study area, the Eastern Ontario data set, and those are all done in an open source or open access license, and you could use that and adapt that to other regions. I think the way that the video conferencing compresses the display, the way it's hard to show a whole lot in the actual Envision interface, but I thought I'd just throw it up there to show that it does work. On my portable, it's a little bit slow, but this is what it looks like when you fire it up. Any questions from the audience about what we've looked at so far? Just try to set the background, set the stage for the rest of the presenters. Nobody's unmuting, so we'll forge on here.